in Maimonides' own handwriting. It is Hebrew and Arabic letters, or Arabic and Hebrew letters, excuse me. So it's Judeo-Arabic that he's written with. The Ben Sira Geniza, I think it is the one I've lost that. Yes, I think so. Quite right. Okay, so he wrote two basic kinds of works. He wrote popular halachic works, and he wrote advanced philosophic works. And this gives you a real sense of the dichotomy of his personality and the sort of trajectory of his thought. So let's deal with the first category. His popular halachic works were written in very simple Hebrew. I mean, remarkably easy Hebrew, intermediate, really like middle school level Hebrew. And they were designed to give a large swath of the Jewish population access, sophisticated and thorough and comprehensive access to the entire corpus of Jewish law. We should remember that one of the huge lacunae in Jewish thought at this time was that there were very few codes in existence. What do I mean by that? The way that Jewish law is organized is that basically it's all found within the Talmud and in successive responsa literature, which we spoke about a few weeks ago when we were talking about the Geonim. The Talmud is not at all organized in a format that we would recognize in the modern world. Basically, the Talmud is like this long stream of consciousness document that has a logical flow to it, but the only way that you can look anything up in the Talmud is if you know the entire Talmud. There is no way to index it appropriately because it's even strange to talk about tangents in the Talmud because all of the Talmud is one long tangent. I'm not exaggerating because you may be studying, for example, the tractate Shabbat, which deals with the laws of the Sabbath, but it's very likely some crucial laws will be found in entirely different tractates that are not titled Tractate Shabbat. It's just the nature of the way that the Talmud organizes it itself. So one of the things that was really missing was a code that essentially took all of this information and organized it in a fashion that people could easily look up the halakha that they were supposed to find. Essentially, like modern books would have chapters and would have sections and would have, paragraphs that are all organized in a logical format. We spoke a little bit about Saadia's influence with the Mutazilite philosophy and methodology a few weeks ago. And the Rambam, although he disagreed with Saadia in many areas, he definitely liked that style of argumentation. So basically, what he did was he wrote this amazing document called the Yad HaChazakah, the strong hand. The word hand, Yad, in Hebrew means 14 because it has 14 books in it. And this was basically a massive code of Jewish law. It was not the first code to be written, but it was clearly the most comprehensive, the easiest to access, and a runaway popular bestseller on the 12th century, New York Times bestseller list. It was such a phenomenal work because it took the entire Talmud, all of the responsa literature written to that day, and put it together in such a way that anyone with very, very basic Hebrew suddenly had access to information that, a rabbi of 80 years of study would have. It was a tremendous device. It was not unlike the kind of information revolution that we have today with, for example, smartphones, with, access to Wikipedia. That's the kind of colossal achievement that Maimonides did in his Mishnah Torah. Naturally, it was very controversial because, if you recall, people were already upset with him because he said rabbis shouldn't take any money for their services. He essentially put them out of business by saying, what do you need a rabbi for? I have the Mishnah Torah. Is this going to come back on, Mr.? Oh, good. Thank you very much. So that means I'm talking too much. If the screensaver turns on, it means that I'm talking too much. I have to definitely go to the next screen. The Mishnah Torah was very, very controversial, as we shall see shortly. He also wrote Sefer HaMitzvot, which was basically addressing the question of what are the mitzvot. I mean, a kind of a you think it's a very basic question, right? Everybody talks about we have 613 mitzvot in the Torah, Taryag mitzvot, but no one ever counts them. No one ever says, well, what are they exactly? So the Rambam set out and combed through the entire Chumash, the 5 books of Moses, and he wrote down exactly what those 613 mitzvot were, and single-handedly created yet another industry of rabbinic scholarship, as people disagree about number 247, saying, no, that's not a mitzvah, that's just a minhag, or number 362, that definitely includes 2 mitzvot, why did you put it together? There's a whole discussion there. But still, these kinds of works, and I should mention also his first work, the commentary on the Mishnah, they represent an entire trend of his thought, saying that the Torah should not belong just to specialists. The Torah should not belong only to those people who have advanced training in the highly arcane Aramaic idiom of the Talmud. The Torah should be something that everyone with just the very basic literary skills should be able to access, literacy skills, excuse me. So that was a phenomenal achievement in itself, and really he could have rested on his laurels having made this signal contribution to the Jewish people, but in fact that was only when he was starting out. The second major body of his written works, and I am excluding here his letters, of which there are hundreds, and say a lot about his personality and his leadership style and so on, but now we're talking more about his formal treatises written for the Jewish world, were books that were written for an entirely different audience. Whereas the Mishnah Torah and the Sefer HaMitzvot were written for the common Jew, the books like Guide for the Perplexed, Mora Nevuchim, were designed specifically for the highly educated, highly sophisticated, but somewhat ambivalent Arabic-speaking Jew of his age. These are Jews who were, this was an era where Jews had tremendous access to all the corridors of learning. There was no real barrier set before them, and no numerous clauses to keep them out of colleges and so on. So they were learning everything that they could, and they were learning the greatest works of Arabic philosophy at the time. And they were thinking to themselves, wait a minute, why be Jewish? Think about how Islam is an advance over Judaism. Judaism has all kinds of strange things in it, like anthropomorphisms for God, and certain bizarre commandments that we have no idea why they're there, like the mixing of wool and linen, so on and so forth. So looking at that highly, specialized but at-risk population, Maimonides wrote this phenomenal philosophical work, the Mora Nevuchim, the Guide for the Perplexed, which was designed specifically to address their philosophical concerns. And unlike the Mishnah Torah, which showed his skill as an encyclopedist, giving him the ability to span the entire, breadth of Jewish thought and put it down in very simple layman's terms, the Guide for the Perplexed was like a mountain climber. He rose to the heights of Jewish thought, engaged in very abstruse and complex philosophical debate to bring across the most sophisticated aspects of Judaism. Guide for the Perplexed was published in Judeo-Arabic, which, among other things, was the vernacular of this segment of the population, but it also allowed him to use the sophisticated philosophical vocabulary of the time that was lacking in Hebrew. In fact, one of the more difficult aspects of the Guide for the Perplexed is that most of its students today do not read Arabic, they read Hebrew, and they have to rely on somewhat problematic Hebrew translations by the Ibn Timmon family that, they themselves were somewhat challenged by the abstruse Arabic philosophical terminology that's used in the book. Nevertheless, it's a huge classic, and since in this book he really brought together a lot of Aristotelian thought with traditional Jewish theology, it had a huge influence later on Christian scholastic thought. St. Thomas Aquinas in particular quotes Maimonides at length with tremendous respect, just as Maimonides would quote Aristotle before him, calling him, for example, ha-philosoph, the philosopher. So there's a chain of transmission of ideas from Aristotle through Maimonides, through Thomas Aquinas, that makes Maimonides one of the very, very few Jews in our history that ever achieved fame for his Jewish works outside of the Jewish world. There are only a handful of people who really reached that level of world fame for their Jewish works, not for something else that they may have done. Like, for example, Albert Einstein, tremendously famous for his theories of relativity and so on, but he's not famous for his commentary on the Mishnah. Maimonides is one of those people who was able to take his Jewish learning and expand it far beyond the limitations of his ethnicity. Okay, questions, arguments about these massive works? Clear as the sun at noonday, right? Oh, yes, Aaron. Right, so I think you're quite prescient in your question, and you're anticipating a little bit of a lecture. The question that's asked for my friends in the Philippines is, did Maimonides, really cross-reference his Mishnah Torah with the Talmud? And in fact, that's one of the main reasons he was criticized, because he specifically omitted all footnotes. There's no question that he is clearly aware of all the debates in the Talmud, and his language is incredibly precise. Even though he uses very simple Hebrew, it's incredibly precise and demanding Hebrew. Like a single vav or a hey can change the entire meaning, and you see why he chose certain phrases. He was criticized because no one could essentially verify his citations. Nobody could say, well, how do we know we should rely on you? The only way we'll know it is if we go and look in the Talmud and verify the trust but verify kind of approach to it. His argument was that since this is a popular work, he did not want to overburden it with massive numbers of footnotes. Later, of course, those footnotes would be researched and written by incredible authorities like none other than Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, who would write a massive commentary on the Mishnah called the Kesef Mishnah that proved the validity of Maimonides' opinions. Whoops, I'm losing it again, right? There we go. Let's go back. Well, actually, let's go straight to the criticisms. Yeah, let's go to the criticisms. Let's go, because really that's what I'm answering right now. And what's going on here? This is anti-Semitism at work here. Okay, here we go. All right, so he was criticized heavily during his lifetime. So why was he criticized? I've already mentioned in response to Aaron's question that he was heavily criticized because he did not include footnotes. He just wrote it down simply and in a straightforward manner because he just wanted to say the halakha the way it was with great self-confidence. He asserted, yes, this is what you're supposed to do, not like those other opinions, this is what you're supposed to do. But, if you were a skeptical reader, there was no way for you to verify it unless you really did the same kind of research he did. Some critics, and his critics were very, very sharp, argued that there was a certain amount of intellectual arrogance in doing so, and simply stating it boldly without offering any kind of justification was an arrogance they felt was a character flaw, and that his books were unreliable as a result. Adding to that the fact that he clearly was heavily influenced by Aristotle, unashamedly so. He felt that Aristotle was a tremendous philosopher, and he was open to the idea of learning from non-Jewish wisdom, which was not necessarily an attitude that was well respected, for example, in the south of France and the Jewish communities there. So his reliance on Aristotle was another element of criticism. Maybe I should just give you like an example of his reliance on Aristotle and a little bit of where he differs. So, for example, in the third chapter of the Nicomachean Ethics, one of Aristotle's greatest philosophical works, he articulates there a definition of virtue, which has come down to us as the golden mean, also known through Maimonides as the Shvil HaZahav, the golden path. And Aristotle describes the golden mean as the midpoint between excess and deficiency. So, for example, if we take the, and you can look at this any character trait you want. Let's choose, for example, courage. So what is the correct definition of courage? Courage is the midpoint between recklessness, which is having too much courage for your own good, doing stupid, taking risks for no reason. That's excess. And on the other hand, deficiency is cowardice. Not being willing to take reasonable risks for reasonable payoffs, that is cowardice. Courage is exactly the midpoint between excess and deficiency. Maimonides says that's the way it is in Hilchot Deot, the 6th chapter in particular. He says, 3rd chapter in particular, he says this is the way it is with every single character trait we have. Love, fear, hate, you name it. There's like a midpoint between too much and too little. That's what we have to do. However, where Maimonides differs, he differs specifically in the a few midot. He says that humility does not admit of an excess. You can always have more humility. There's no midpoint when it comes to humility. And that's clearly differing from Aristotle. Similarly, he argues that anger does not have a minimum, that you have to learn to completely remove anger from your heart. He does say, of course, that you are allowed to feign anger for your children, which we do regularly at home. For your students, you have to appear displeased and stern in order to, appropriately teach them the correct way to behave. But he says always it should be just kas al hapanim, v'lo kas al halev, right? It should be anger just on the face. It's an exterior anger, not anger in the heart. Now you look puzzled, Ms. Abramson. You have some problems with that? I really was angry with you, by the way, on Sunday morning, so I'm not on Maimonides in that way. But.
No, it's just that if you think about it, how can you completely get rid of anger? How can you learn to see your love at all? That can't be healthy at all. Especially Dr. Very examples, just talking about some of the point. But we see one of the differences between Judaism and Christianity is that we don't try to stay completely in our beliefs, that we recognize the issue and then deal with it and find that balance. So how can you say you shouldn't have
Right. Well, that's a very well put question, and I am somewhat proud of her. Yes, I'm like moderately proud, right? Somewhere between excess and deficiency proud. Right? But he says, in fact, that anger does not admit of a minimum. Anger is something that is so corrosive. It's like saying you're allowed to drink a little poison. It's something that you have. It's an avoda. It is a task of character development that you have to learn to detach yourself from anger. How to do it? Look, we can study Hilchos Deos together, and we can have a look at it and see how he says it. But it's clearly a huge task. So it's okay. Follow-up question. It better be short.
So, is it even more that you should strive to actually have no anger? And I have this guilt is like, it shouldn't be as if like you actually recognize it.
No, it's the other way. What you're saying does fit with the author of the Sefer Achinuch, the anonymous author. Some say is Rabbi David of Barcelona, that he says what you do on the outside affects your inside. But the Rambam says the opposite. He says you may, and in fact sometimes you must, pretend to be angry, but don't let it into your heart, because it'll just give you an ulcer. It's going to make you unhappy, and it's just internally corrosive. Okay, more later. Okay, can I see another hand? And, I have to live with her in the same house, Yes, right. Okay, so God is allowed to do so. Li hanakama, vengeance is mine, nobody else's, right? Hashem ge'ud lavesh. Hashem can dress in gava, in arrogance, but we can't. So just because certain attributes are given to Hashem Yishmer Kama, that doesn't mean that we can do those things. Very, very astute observation. And in fact, it's quite apropos, because one of the other reasons that he was criticized is because of his take on allegory and anthropomorphisms. We are, okay, I give up. You're right. I don't know how to answer that. We are B'Tselem Elokim, but yeah, that's good. I'm not exactly sure how to deal with that one. That's a tough one. I mean, I can give you sources to back up my point of view, but I don't understand them now that you ask a question like that. No, come on, leave me alone, Lisa. Okay, give me an answer later. Let's get. Yeah, this is supposed to be like an organized lecture where one person talks and everybody listens. Okay, right. So one of the arguments was that he dealt with allegory. Oh my gosh, this is a punishment. He dealt with allegory in a very difficult way because the Torah does speak extensively in allegorical terms. The hand of God, the finger of God. The Talmud says that God wakes in the middle of the night. God experiences emotions and things like that. But Maimonides was, he tended to discount these allegories as much as possible because he was an incredible rationalist. This is one of the areas where he stands apart from the bulk of the rabbis of his era, the Rishonim. He was very much opposed to mystical readings of the texts. This is frustrating me. Yeah, no, it's not getting me angry though. But he was very opposed to. I'm looking angry. Okay, this is getting out of hand. So he was opposed to any kind of supernatural interpretations of Judaism. He had a lot of problems dealing with all these Talmudic passages in the Talmud speaking about demons and like spells and all kinds of sort of magical things. He felt that they were all, complex rabbinic allegories, but they didn't actually mean straightforward meaning of reading the text. And in fact, it's a difficult position to hold, and he was going against the mainstream to be sure. So, for example, in the Bible, there's a lot of these kind of supernatural stories. For example, the story of the witch of Endor, when King Shaul is concerned about what's going to happen in the upcoming battle with the Philistines. And so he goes to a witch, and she performs a seance and brings back the dead prophet Shmuel to tell Shaul what's going to happen. And then there's a whole story there where Shmuel wakes up and says, "What are you bothering me for?" And Shaul says, "I want to know what's going to happen in the war tomorrow." He says, "Why ask me now? Tomorrow you can ask me face to face," which is a way of saying that you're going to die in the battle, which is, of course, what happened. So when you read that biblical passage in a straightforward way, it seems like, there was a seance and the prophet was brought back to life and so on. So Maimonides has a kind of complex and convoluted way to interpret it, saying that, no, it was all smoke and mirrors, and that the witch had an accomplice who was pretending to be Shmuel and so on. Sometimes it's kind of stretched, but you get a sense of Maimonides' feeling that he really wanted to make everything as rational as possible. And so those areas, he came into conflict with a lot of the other rabbis, Rashi, for example, who, would predeceased Maimonides, but of the same era, who felt that, this mystical world of spirits and demons and things was in fact valid. Yes, please. He wrote a lot on Agadas, but he wanted to say that the Agadas were all, metaphors for complex philosophical truths. Same thing with the Midrashim. Yeah, he was brutal when it came to those kinds of things. Now, for these reasons, the lack of footnoting, which some interpreted as a kind of a scholarly arrogance, his reliance on Aristotle, a non-Jewish philosopher, his disparaging attitude towards the supernatural aspect of Judaism got him into a lot of trouble with the Ashkenazi rabbis of Southern France in particular. And what they ended up doing was, seeing his popularity, the Jews went to the Dominican friars. The Dominicans were a fairly extreme group of monks in France at the time, and they complained that there's these books circulating among the Jews that are heretical in nature, that are portraying God in an inappropriate fashion and so on. Now, the Dominicans, it's kind of a funny thing. Why are Jews going and complaining to the Dominicans? Unfortunately, this is the kind of thing that we have in Jewish history quite often, that when there is an internal Jewish fight, I'm sorry? He's allowed to do what? I'm sorry. Yeah. Oh, you can learn from. Okay, you want to say Aristotle? Fine, sure, but you know, the citation is "Mikom lamdai hiskalti." From all my teachers, I gained wisdom. But you know, that's just not the way necessarily the Jewish world works. I mean, if I were to say, you know, if Rabbi Grunstein were to get up and say, you know, I learned Torah from Oprah Winfrey, I just don't know if the community would receive it as well as if he said I learned it from. Yeah. Actually, he probably would. He could get away with that because he does special things with Torah. But let me stick to where I am right now, anyways, in the lecture. So, for these reasons, they went to Dominicans. Why would they go to Dominicans? It is an unfortunate reality. You can see it echoed in the halakhic literature that when Jews are dissatisfied with a particular dispute, they will go to non-Jewish authorities, hoping to leverage their support in the dispute. And it almost always ends up badly. Once you take it outside of the family and you start having a dispute in the street, it ends up awful. So they went to the Dominicans and they said, you know, you guys are interested in us being good Jews, right? So there are these books by this guy named Moses something or other that are just corrupting our minds and doing things differently, and we really think that they don't belong in our bookshelves. So the Dominicans said, fine, let us help you out with that. And they collected up all the manuscripts of Maimonides they could find, and they burned them publicly in 1232. A very, very sad moment in Jewish history, and ironically, it would be repeated 10 years later, because once the Dominicans got a bit of a taste of burning heretical Jewish books, they expanded their options a little bit, and they burned about 12 wagonfuls of Talmuds, precious manuscripts. This is well before the era of printing, in the same spot in Paris that they had burned Maimonides. So it's a sad day when we start burning our own books. You know, eventually they will come back to haunt us. At that point, the dispute about Maimonides and his works reached a kind of a fever pitch, and so the great Rashba, a very important Jewish rabbi of the time, argued for a compromise in 1305, which was ultimately accepted. This is already a century after Maimonides himself is deceased, and the compromise indicated that nobody could study books like the Moreh Nevuchim until they were at least 25 years old. They set up certain parameters. These books are kosher, these books are definitely valuable, but they should not be studied except by people who had a certain level of training. By 25, you would think a person had sufficient literacy and training and so on. And that ultimately kind of was a flag of truce between the anti-Maimonidean camp and the Maimonidean camp, and preserved Maimonides' writings to this day. Yes, Fred. So that's an excellent question. Are the remaining writings legitimate? So legitimate is a tough word to really evaluate in this case. Authoritative is also another difficult one. I'll put it like this. There's no question that Maimonides' contribution is respected even by his detractors. And in fact, I would say that there are no serious detractors from Maimonides today. However, that does not mean that his opinion is considered the definitive one, especially in practical halakhic matters. For example, he wrote this great code, the Mishnah Torah, in the 12th century. It was 400 years later, that the great Yosef Karo wrote his code, the Shulchan Aruch, which is really the definitive code for today. Now, when Rabbi Yosef Karo wrote his code, he basically took together three rabbinic opinions, that of Rav Alfas, the Rambam, and the Tur, the three very important codes that were written. And if there was dispute between the three of them, he would go with the majority. The majority often did not agree with Maimonides. So that meant that the code of law that is considered definitive for Jews today, in just off the top of my head, I would guess maybe 5 to 10% of issues, it disagrees with Maimonides. In 90 to 95% of issues, it agrees with Maimonides because they're all uniform on a topic. But there's a significant number of things that Maimonides says we should do it this way, and yet the accepted custom is to do it another way. So because in the Jewish tradition, We highly value, sincere, rejected opinions. And that's something that's really ingrained right from the Mishnah with Hillel and Shammai all the way through our tradition. Maimonides happens to be the odd man out more than anyone else when it comes to practical halakha. Nevertheless, he also wrote on a far wider scale than the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch that we have today is very modest. It only deals with those laws of daily life that apply when the temple is destroyed. The Mishnah Torah of the Rambam, he wrote about the laws that apply when the temple is in existence. He wrote about the laws that would apply when the Messiah arrives. He wrote about the laws of things that are not even touched in the Code of Jewish Law, like how to sleep, as I mentioned earlier, how to think, how to believe, how to eat. Incredibly scope of activities that the Shulchan Aruch says that's just way too much for us to get involved with. So in those areas, he is the only opinion. The laws of the Messiah, for example, what is life going to be like at the time of the Messiah? Maimonides is our go-to source because no one else wrote about it. So he is definitely very authoritative in those areas. Okay, that's an excellent question. Okay, yes, last question, then I'll wrap up. Rabbi Shneir Zalman, the first ROTHSCHILD Rabbi? Yeah, I don't know how to answer that question. He wrote a Shulchan Aruch called the Shulchan Aruch Harav, which definitely relies heavily on the Rambam. But he's a huge opinion. Everybody has to rely heavily on the Rambam today. Doesn't mean that we'll always agree with him, but nevertheless, his opinion is valid in the vast majority of cases. Yeah. Oh, the 13 principles. Let me just take a second to report on that. Then I want to wrap up because I want to stay on time. Some of the things that Maimonides did, which were also controversial, I didn't really mention them earlier. He was big in codifying things. So one of the things he codified was, what exactly did Jews believe? It's kind of funny that here it is, we're in the 12th century. The Jews have been in exile for 1,200 years, and they've been in existence for another, 1,500, 2,000 years before that. And nobody ever sat down and said, okay, what exactly do we believe? Can we just agree on this? So Maimonides said, okay, let's write it down. And he came up with 13 basic principles of what Jews should believe. It says something about our religion, though, that we can go so long without ever having to actually agree on something that's so basic. But he wrote 13 basic principles that say things like, yeah, God exists, God is one, God is non-corporeal, we're waiting for a Jewish Messiah, he hasn't come yet, don't confuse us with that other religion. There is life after death, things like that, saying that the Torah is valid. These are the basics of Jewish belief that he codified. Of course, once you put it out there, saying these are our 13 core beliefs, then you'll have 1,000 people who disagree with you. And so he was also criticized very heavily for even daring to suggest that these are our beliefs held in common. Okay, so let me wrap it up by talking a little bit about his legacy. This is his grave in Tiberia, although as I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, the Cairoese Jews would disagree with that. His legacy is absolutely phenomenal. He literally started the entire industry of codes in the way that we understand it today by taking a very bold intellectual leap and saying, we can reorganize the Talmud. For example, the way he referred to the Mishnah Torah, this was also criticism. He said, listen, all you really need to be a good Jew is your Chumash, right, the first 5 books of Moses, and my book, the Mishnah Torah, the repetition of the Torah. That's really all you need to be a good Jew. And that was a very bold intellectual statement, but by and large, it's got a lot of truth to it as well, even though we differ in how to interpret it. He worked as an indefatigable, is that a real word? Indefatigable. Thank you for saying that correctly. I should get to the microphone. Tireless worker for Jewish causes. We only very briefly touched on this in the lecture. And he also created tremendous philosophical works. And on the side, he was an extremely successful physician with a very lucrative practice and a good publication record. So Maimonides is really one of those towering figures in Jewish history, but I strongly urge you to encounter his writings for yourself because they really are quite brilliant. They're available in English translation if you find the Judeo-Arabic or the Hebrew challenging. And once again, I want to thank you very much for your endurance and your attention tonight. And I look forward to speaking with you next week. Okay. Tonight's lecture is going to be about one of Israel's greatest military leaders, the famous Shimon Bar Kokhba, who led a courageous and heroic and ultimately successful, albeit on a temporary level, attempt to drive the Romans out of Israel and retake Jerusalem. This rebellion occurred probably around the year 132 of the Common Era. We have some questions about the specific dating, but it's certainly about 60 years after the destruction of the temple, 70 odd years after the destruction of the temple, and he actually succeeded in driving out this massive Roman army, which was incomprehensibly powerful, and the Romans, in order to push the Jews back, had to invest a phenomenal amount of men, perhaps as many as 250,000 troops, to be able to beat down a strange but persistent guerrilla force of the Jews hiding out in the Judean hills. It's a rather amazing and heroic story, but it has a lot of twists and turns regarding his own personality, including the fact that many of the rabbis felt that he was actually Mashiach. They felt that he was the Messiah, the long-awaited Redeemer. None other than Rabbi Akiva, the great Rabbi Akiva, believed that Bar Kokhba was the Messiah. Ultimately, however, he himself was killed and his venture failed, and the Romans were able to enforce even a harsher punishment on the Jews and really reinforce the diaspora that had begun with the destruction of the temple in the first century. But anyways, that's the story that we're going to explore tonight. Part of our story revolves around this image, which is not so clear. I'm sorry, but I'll get a better one, I think, for next week. This is a cave of letters. It's a remote cave in one of the walled sheer cliffs that are surrounding the Dead Sea. And in 1960, the great Israeli general and archaeologist Yigal Yadin, explored these caves and discovered a tremendous cache of documents, artifacts, utensils that were hidden there by the Bar Kokhba rebels in one of their last stands. So we'll have occasion to look at the documents that were found there, the artifacts that were found there, and it will lead us as well into next week's topic as well. Okay, let's get started with the material per se. So setting the tone for the uprising, we should recall that this occurred in the context of the Emperor Hadrian's rule over Israel. Not to be confused with Herod, we spoke about last week. Hadrian ruled from the year 117 to the year 138. And initially, his approach to the Jews and to Israel seemed to have been somewhat conciliatory. In fact, there are several legends recorded in the Talmud in which he considered rebuilding the temple, which is an amazing thing. The temple, we should remember, was not only a center of religious significance for the Jews, it was their ultimate national center as well. It was kind of like the White House, the Congress, the Capitol, everything. It was Washington, D.C. for the Jews. And to have lost the temple meant that their very sense of national self was destroyed. So a concession by allowing him to rebuild the temple would have really meant that he had felt that Judea had been pacified and that the Jews could regain some sense of their identity and then they could move on. Let us recall what we discussed last week, that the Roman strategy of government was one of divide et impera, dividing and ruling, where They did not like to invest massive amounts of troops and administrators to directly administer a territory. They much preferred to sort of co-opt the elite and allow them to run their own government, kind of in a Quisling fashion if you think of World War II with countries like Norway and so on. They wanted them to run their own affairs. They just said, you pay us tribute and you give us the proper obeisances and we will be very happy to let you run your country. So that may have been the reasoning behind the legend surrounding his openness initially to rebuilding the temple. I'm going to read you a passage here from the Midrash, and we should understand that, the rabbis who recorded the Midrashim are not trying to record historical data as we understand it today. They're primarily trying to convey religious messages, which they will couch within the context of the historical realities of their time, but they will not necessarily they won't feel hard bound to be completely accurate in every detail, because that's not the message that they're trying to convey. It's kind of like, if you think about the hermeneutics of the ancient text, it's like the difference between a prescription and a love poem. A prescription has to be totally and completely exact. What drug, what dosage, how often you take it, all those things are really important, or else, a disaster can happen. A love poem, on the other hand, can employ hyperbole, it can employ, similes, metaphors, all kinds of things. Could you imagine if your doctor said, give him something sort of like Xanax, right? You can't do that. It has to be exactly Xanax or whatever it is. So these midrashic texts also are trying to convey the information like a love poem, as it were. We can't read them like prescriptions because that's not the way they were written. Okay, so here we go. In the days of Rabbi Yoshua ben Hananiah, the Roman government, that's under Hadrian, decreed that the temple should be rebuilt. Pappus and Lulianus, these are two important rabbis at the time, set up tables from Akko to Antioch and provided for the Olim from the Galut, meaning they set up these tables principally, it seems, to allow people to start exchanging their local currencies for Israeli shekels, so that they could, because the term tables in Midrashic Hebrew means money changers. Those Kutim then went and sent to the emperor. Anybody know who the Kutim are? Kutim are the Samaritans. So we're going to get to them in a second, but the Kutim, and that's in the next slide actually, the Kutim and the Samaritans had a very difficult time with each other. The Kutim, or Samaritans, and the Jews proper had a difficult time with each other. I'll explain who they are in a moment. But at any rate, here, they're going to essentially ruin the plan. The Kutim then went and said to the emperor, "Be it known now unto the king that if this city be builded and the walls finished," I love this translation, "they will not pay tribute, impost, or toll. Said he, the emperor, to them, to the Samaritans, What is to be done, seeing that I have already issued the decree? Said they to him, Send to them and say, either change the site of the temple, or enlarge it by 5 cubits, or diminish it by 5 cubits. Then they will of themselves abandon the venture." The story in this midrash is that the Samaritans, who wanted to ruin the possibility of rebuilding the temple, they said to the emperor, Hadrian, you can't let them have the temple. He says, what can I do? I already said I would let them have the temple. So they said to him, you know what? And do this. Tell him you can have the temple, but you have to put it someplace else. Like the embassy can be in Tel Aviv. It can't be in Jerusalem, for example. That was a joke. So thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. So not a joke, but it was like a quip. Can I keep the quips? Maybe the Latvians will stay if I have a quip or two. Okay. The other thing is, or say to them, you can have your temple, but it should be a little bit roomier. Enlarge it by 5 cubits, which is the equivalent of about 9 feet or so. Or shrink it by 5 cubits. Now, why wouldn't the Jews say, sure, let's do it? Because the temple has to be exact, right? The measurements are described in Tanakh exactly the way it is. And so by telling them, you can have the temple, but it has to be a little bit bigger, they won't be able to accept it. And so what will happen, this is the plan of the Kutim, they are Jewish, by the way. I mean, we'll see exactly how Jewish and what context, but they ruined the plot because the Jews would have to refuse, and ultimately Hadrian got his way. A throng of Israel had congregated in the vale of Beth Rimmon when the letters of the emperor arrived. The people began to weep. Then a spirit of revolt began to sweep through the assemblage. Some said, Let a sage stand forth and calm the people. The sage would, of course, be one of the Pharisees. We talked about him last week. They said, let Rabbi Yeshua ben Chaneh stand forth, for he is a great scholar of the Torah. So then Rabbi Yeshua arose and he expounded this parable. It's a good parable. I'm going to use it on my kids. Once a lion ate of his prey, and he got a bone stuck in his throat. Said the lion, if anyone can get the bone out of my throat, he will get a reward. There came an Egyptian heron who stuck his beak into the lion's throat and pulled out the bone. Said the heron, give me my reward. Said the lion, be off with you. Go and boast that you entered the lion's mouth and got out of there safely. So it is with the Jews. This is Rabbi Yeshua. We ought to be satisfied that even though we got entangled with the Romans, we got disentangled without coming to harm. Right, so the parable of the story is that even though, and some elements of this may be exactly conform to reality, that maybe Hadrian had this policy, he thought it might work, and then because of the internal conflict, specifically with the Samaritans, who were significant force in Israel at the time, he would come to a bad end, so he decided to change his mind. And Rabbi Yeshua ben Prachia, Rabbi Yeshua ben Hanania, representing the Pharisees, said, you know what? It's fine. We will do without the temple as long as we can do without the Romans as well. That was, of course, sort of the attitude of the sages in a non-revolting fashion. But you saw that there was a chorus of voices saying we should fight against the Romans for the chutzpah of asking us to change our temple. Okay, so let's just go a little further and try to figure out who are these Samaritans here. I'm sure you've heard the term the Good Samaritan. Does anybody know the meaning of that term? So what is a Good Samaritan? Oh, give me the modern terminology, please. Just what do we mean by it today? Very nice. Okay, and why does that person have to be a Samaritan? What's the shot in Samaritan? Well, here's the parable. Basically, it occurs in the New Testament. I think it's in Luke. I'm sure a lot of my viewers will probably correct me. But what happens is there's a disciple who talks to Jesus, or it may have been actually an opponent, I can't remember. He says to Jesus, how am I supposed to love my neighbor as myself? I mean, come on, am I supposed to really do all these things? I don't see anybody doing those things, right? So Jesus says, let me give you a parable. He says, there's a guy who's like mugged, and he's like lying on the side of the road bleeding. It's this beautiful kind of like, I'm not sure who painted this, but sort of a Renaissance feel to it. Guy lying on the side of the road bleeding. And along comes a Kohen, a Jew, and sees him and then passes by. Crosses the street. Then along comes a Levite, a Levi, sees him, doesn't want to deal with him, it's messy, the guy's bleeding, and across the other street. And along comes a Putin, a Samaritan, and he helps him nevertheless. He bandages him up, he takes him to a hotel, he tells the innkeeper, whatever it costs, I'll pay it, I'll come back in a little while to check on him, the whole thing. And that is the Good Samaritan. But the point that we have to understand in the story is that the Samaritans and the Jews hated each other bitterly. The Samaritans were a group of people who had converted to Judaism under duress. And their whole story is described in Tanakh, that they were afraid that if they didn't convert to Judaism, they would be devoured by these lions. And so their conversion to Judaism was sort of suspect for a good 400 years. And a good part of the Talmud, Tractate Brachot in particular, goes back and forth. Do we consider them Jews or not Jews? Can we count them in a minyan? If we're eating and the waiter is one of these Samaritans, can the waiter be included as Zimun for the benching? Going back and forth deciding, are they Jews or are they not Jews? And as a result, not surprisingly, the Samaritans did not like the traditional rabbinic Jews in return. Ultimately, they divided very sharply, where the Samaritans set up a temple-like cult on Har Gerizim, on Mount Gerizim, which is, I believe, near Nablus. It's a mountain up near Nablus, and they even to this day, by the way, Samaritans, they still sacrifice on certain holidays, goats and things like that, because it's sort of like the ancient temple cult, but it is a Samaritan version. And so at that point, the rabbi said, that's it, but definitely we're not considering them Jews, they're off. And they had a tremendous fight with each other throughout the entire entire time. Another example of how they used to fight is the rabbis, when they would announce the new moon, they would signal to far-off communities that the new moon had been declared, so people would know when is Rosh Chodesh, when is Pesach, when is all these holidays, and they would do it by, lighting signal fires on mountaintops. And from far away, you would see the fires. You would light a fire and go on until the Samaritans started waiting and lighting fires on their own on the wrong days. So it messed up the whole system, and we had to go to a printed calendar, and synagogues made a lot of money as a result because they could print catalogs. But at any rate, so the story, Jesus' story, is only understandable in the context of the fight between the Jews and the Samaritans. It's like saying all the people who should have helped this Jewish guy on the road, they refused to, and of all people, Dafka, it's a Samaritan who helps him. It's like saying, you're let's say you're stuck in a really bad neighborhood, and all of the inner city population, rich people are walking by, let's say white middle class Americans are walking by, leaving alone, and then an inner city resident who is dirt poor walks up and takes care of you. It's like Dafka, it's the Samaritan who helps them. Did I make that a little too long? I think so. Well, okay, thank you, Judith. All right, so anyways, there's three basic groups of Jews who are vying for authority in Israel at this point, and they have different relationships vis-a-vis Rome. The Pharisees we spoke about. The Pharisees are trying to practice this, like Yochanan ben Zakkai that we discussed the other day. They're trying to practice a sort of tactical retreat. They're trying to stay disentangled, disengaged from Rome. You leave us alone, we'll leave you alone, and they're trying to just stay out of Rome's way and manage their own Torah affairs in closed disciple circles. The Christians are being horribly persecuted, and they're being persecuted both by the Romans in a very physical and fatal way, and they're also being persecuted to a degree by the Pharisees by being excluded from the Jewish body politic. Again, remember that when I use the term Christian in the 2nd century, we're talking about a mixed population of Jews who adopt Christianity as a faith system, and their version of Christianity, Jewish Christianity, if you want to call it that, is basically all the mitzvos plus belief in Jesus. And you also have a growing population, especially outside of Israel, of Gentiles who adopt Christianity, and they are practicing no mitzvot, but believing in Jesus. So it's a mixed population. It doesn't make sense. Well, these are Gentiles, meaning they're like Romans, Greeks, from Asia Minor, all these places, and they leave essentially paganism to become Christians, but they feel no reason to go through Judaism to get to Christianity. They go straight to Christianity, and therefore they don't pick up keeping kosher, keeping Shabbat, things like that. And there's internal struggles within the Christian world, but definitely they are united against the Romans and united against the Jews as well. I mean, the rabbinic Jews. And then finally you have these Samaritans who are trying to have some kind of engagement with the Romans and trying to betray the Jews, as we saw in that story with Adrian. And there's a lot of conflict as a result. To a certain degree, it will affect the Bar Kokhba revolution, but I didn't include too much of it in this particular lecture. So we have basically two major accounts, non-Jewish accounts of the Bar Kokhba revolution. I'll show you some depictions of the historians there. But there's a broad agreement on the major causes of the war. We know that civil society was breaking apart in the 3rd decade, the 2nd decade of the 2nd century. That there was a tremendous amount of hooliganism, there was a tremendous amount of banditry, quite a bit of it actually perpetrated by Jews. We have Jewish bandits on the road throughout Israel, and the Romans are not particularly exercising much control. They're not trying to establish a ROTHSCHILD, a society governed by law. They're just basically letting it become lawless as long as it doesn't affect the governing authorities. There's some amazing stories of these bandits who are kind of frum in a way. They're kind of like pious in a way. Like the Talmud describes one man who was being led off to execution, and as he is being carried away to being executed, he shouts, "Tell the widow of Shimon that I murdered him on the way to the city of," Lord, I can't remember what city it was. But here he is. Why would he reveal that? Why would he say he's off being executed, and he's letting the widow of so-and-so know that he was the one who killed her husband. Yeah, good question. Anyone want to offer a suggestion? What if the body was never found? Right? So if the body was never found, then she would be an aguna. She would not be allowed to remarry. Well, if she were to remarry, right, against the rabbinic approval. So by going and shouting, "I killed him," that meant that she was no longer an aguna. She was a widow and therefore could remarry. So then the rabbis got into a big tumult. Oh my gosh, do we accept the testimony of a guy who's being let out to be executed? I mean, how reliable is that for testimony? It concluded in a woman's favor, saying that yes, the fact that he admitted to killing this guy, we would accept it in order to render her able to marry another man. But that you get a sense of the kind of confused period of the time. That here's a person who has no problem murdering another Jew, but he's about to execute it. He wants to definitely save this other woman from being an aguna. So the local governing authorities began to really crack down heavily. In particular, one individual named Tineus Rufus, or Rufus Turnus, as he's known in the Talmud, began to impose some really severe measures on the Jewish population, outlawing a lot of basic Jewish practices. There's some debate about which specific ones, the observance of the Sabbath, observing circumcision, and so on. But there are a lot of stories of brutality from this one Turnus Rufus that certainly escalated the conflict. Now, Dio Cassius, or Cassius Dio, shown here, the Roman historian from the late 1st century, early 2nd century, late 1st, 2nd century, early 3rd century, who wrote that the flashpoint for the revolt was specifically Hadrian's destruction of Jerusalem and its renaming as Aela Capitolina, meaning that was totally the opposite of his earlier policy of perhaps rebuilding the temple. And most historians follow Cassius Dio in their line of thinking. However, Eusebius, shown here, who is a church historian, is our other major non-Jewish source on this period, he says that actually the temple was raised, or the Aela Capitolina was renamed, Jerusalem was raised further after the revolt as kind of a punishment for Bar Kokhba rebellion. So historians at this point did not know exactly what was the flashpoint that caused it. One thing we do know is that Hadrian had just left Israel. He was on this kind of grand tour of the Middle East, and he left Israel, and that's obviously when the Zealots felt, okay, this is the time that we can finally rise up against the Romans. Dio Cassius says that the Jews had a unique strategy for obtaining weapons. They had a certain amount of gun control, as it were, in the ancient world. It wasn't possible for just anybody to just produce weapons. I mean, it made a lot of noise, the banging, the clanging, you had to get the raw materials and so on. And the Romans kept a tight control over the weapons that were circulating. So according to Cassius Dio, the Jews were forced to produce weapons for the Romans in their own forges and so on. And the Jews would intentionally make poor quality swords, meaning they would have a defective one every 2 or 3 swords, and they would hand these over to the Romans, and the Romans would say, "What is this garbage?" And they say, "Feh," and they would probably not say "Feh," but they would give the swords back and say, "Give us better quality swords." And according to Cassius Dio, that's how the Jews were able to accumulate a large amount of metal and a large amount of admittedly defective swords, but that they were able to arm themselves. We don't have much evidence for this particular legend, but it's an interesting one. What we do have evidence of, however, is approximately 125 tunnels found to date that they were used by Bar Kokhba and his rebels. Their strategy was to build these underground tunnels throughout, in particular, Judea, but also stretching forward into Galilee. Anyway, they built these and they hid in them, and they used them, when the Romans would approach, they would go out and they would have these guerrilla attacks on the Romans, and eventually they would seize towns one at a time, fortify them. The Romans, unfortunately, had the contrary strategy, which when they finally came in to take care of the rebellion, they besieged these towns terribly, and we have some tremendous massacres as a result. But the underground tunnels were one of the major features of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, and many of them are really quite ingenious and extensive in nature. One that I'll show you at the end of this lecture was actually 300 meters in length, inside a very remote cliffside, and it had 3 separate chambers and all kinds of amazing things. Okay, now the star of the rebellion literally was Shimon Bar Kokhba. His name was probably Koseva, which is probably a family name. Koseva, we're not exactly sure. But he was known as Bar Kokhba. The word Kochav in Hebrew means star. And so there was this homiletic sort of appreciation of his name, the son of a star, because there was a passage in the Bible that refers to a star that will emerge from Jacob, meaning the Messiah. Mashiach will come from the line of Jacob, and he will, create this political unity of the Jews. He will be a brilliant military leader, and he will restore sovereignty to the Jews in Israel. And actually, that's what Bar Kokhba was able to achieve in his short life. However, his ultimate betrayal of the cause, for various reasons, led to great disillusionment among the rabbis, and they referred to him in a rather derogatory fashion later as Bar Koziba. Kazav in Hebrew means to lie. So what was once son of a star became son of a lie, because it was all for naught. At any rate, as a military leader, he was exceptionally aggressive and demanding. We have quite a few documents written in his name, letters commanding his officers to move to this place, or move to that place, and so on. But he was extremely abrupt and even cruel to his underlings. He would frequently refer to their punishment if they failed to follow his orders. He was insisting that his underlings are betraying the people if they do not follow his orders exactly, precisely to the letter, and that he was constantly threatening them with different things. He also had an even aggressive style vis-a-vis God, and this is something that the rabbis took him to task for, perhaps post facto, but apparently when it came to praying for their victories, he said to God, don't help, but don't interfere either. And he said, God, stay out of it, and I will take care of it myself. A tremendous chutzpah, but you get a sense of the kind of personality of the man. At the same time, again, it's a confusing period. It's like the bandits that we spoke about earlier. We have evidence that while they were in hiding, they were specifically sending requests out for the Arba Minim, or the Lulav and Etrog, for the Sukkot holidays. Apparently, they were extremely expensive in the Dead Sea, and they had to import them from Yerushalayim or something. But they're also very attached to traditional religious Judaism, rabbinic Judaism at the same time. There's no question that in terms of his personal character, his midos, he would not be elected chief rabbi of the year. But on the other hand, in terms of his military leadership and his brilliance as a strategist, there was unparalleled. And ultimately, he was successful in driving out the Romans. Now, it was in this context that we should understand his nomination as the Messiah, because there's a lot written about what exactly is the Messiah in the Jewish tradition, but at its fundament, the Mashiach is believed to be, and there was a discussion of 2 Mashiachim, there were 2 of them, one following another, but basically Mashiach is a human being in Jewish tradition, a totally human being, not the Son of God, obviously, who will lead a military victory and bring all the Jews back to the land of Israel and establish a level of security for the Jews in the Holy Land. And so everything that Bar Kokhba was doing was in fact leading to these goals. And when he finally conquered Jerusalem, it seemed that the messianic predictions were all coming true in the person of this one Bar Kokhba. According to Maimonides, who wrote the best synopsis of Jewish philosophy on what Mashiach is, of who Mashiach will be, he wrote that Bar Kokhba could have been Mashiach, but he sinned, and as a result, he was killed for his sins. The sins may have included things like the very, chutzpahdik attitude to God, things like that. Akiva, the great rabbi of his times, was a follower of Bar Kokhba. Some have argued that he lobbied for him actively throughout the Jewish diaspora, but he certainly, argued forcefully that Bar Kokhba was the Messiah. He was not. There was multiple voices, however, among the Pharisees, and as I think I mentioned in the bulletin, Rabbi Yochanan ben Tarta said to Akiva, grass will grow from your cheeks before the Messiah comes, meaning that you're going to be dead and buried and you'll be fertilizing the grass. You can't rely on Bar Kokhba to be Mashiach. So it's not one unanimous voice among the rabbis, but Rabbi Akiva was primus inter pares. He was one of the greatest of them, so his voice was extremely important. This is, by the way, a document from some of the Bar Kokhba papers or papyri that have found itself to the present day. So here's a map showing where the revolt was centered. It did eventually spread to the north, but it was essentially in the area of Yehuda. That's around Jerusalem to the east, around the Dead Sea. The revolt started when Hadrian left town about the year 132. As I mentioned, the strategy of Bar Kokhba was to go town by town, village by village, drive out whatever Roman troops were there, immediately take over the entire location, probably had a lot of sympathizers among the local population, dig these tunnels and fortify and get ready for the Romans to counterattack. And ultimately, going in this fashion, town by town, village by village, they were able to conquer the entire area, including Jerusalem, which was really quite an amazing achievement. Here is one of the many coins that was minted by Bar Kokhba. What they used to do is very soft, malleable metals. They would heat up Roman coins until they were kind of soft, and then they would simply stamp over the emperor's face with whatever new symbols they wanted to import. And let's have a look at some of these symbols here. Anyone recognize this structure here? The Mishnah, or I would say it's a little bit later, the Beit HaMikdash. This is the Holy of Holies, right? Which was created by Herod in a kind of a neoclassical style. That's why you have the kind of Greek style columns, things like that. So what does it mean that Bar Kokhba is putting this on his coinage? What are his values? They're clearly, very national, religious. Let's get back to Jerusalem. Let's get our temple sacrifice going. That was like a really important thing. This little item up here, anyone figure out what that is? I'm sorry? I'll get not a lion. This little thing up there. I'll give you a hint. It twinkles. Star, right? And who's that? Bar Kokhba, right? So the star on top of the temple, the Bar Kokhba, his star is shining there. That's the symbol. Now this is, I believe, this is supposed to be some kind of lulav. I'm not positive about it. I may be confusing this with another coin. But again, also a religious symbol. The coinage, Mr. Rodriguez was trying to figure out the Phoenician Hebrew. These are actually old-style Hebrew letters, and they say things like Shimon, or Shimon Bar Kokhba, for the freedom of Jerusalem. I haven't been able to actually decipher these myself, but I read about this in other books, so you have to take my word for it. Now, so this is like the high point of the victory was the conquest of Jerusalem, which he held for possibly 3 years. But the Romans counterattacked, obviously, and they brought in troops from all over. The Romans had taken a terrible beating, so much so that in his report to the Senate, the Emperor Hadrian omitted a key phrase. Normally, when they communicate with each other, the Emperor writes, greetings to you, senators. I and my army are well. He omitted the and my army part, because they were really taking a beating in Judea, which was, can you imagine from a Roman perspective? They just can't deal with these Jews. I mean, every few generations, they're rebelling. And who are they? It's these tiny little people. The Roman Empire extends from Scotland all the way out, basically to Afghanistan, all around the Mediterranean basin, and they just can't deal with these Jews. Keep on fighting back. What's wrong with them? So he sends in 14 legions. How big is a legion? I looked it up. They vary in size, but the minimum size is about 1,000 troops. And a lot of these troops would have secondary troops attached to them, kind of like squires. So when you figure out what 14 legions mean, it's approximately, 10,000 troops. 140 to 225,000 troops were brought into Israel to quell the rebellion. We have inscriptions left by these Roman battalions and legions all over Israel when they were attacking Bar Kokhba. It was really a full court press against them. He even brought generals from Britain all the way across the Mediterranean to deal with the Jewish problem. It was definitely a major military effort by the Romans. You can compare it perhaps to, let's say, the Warsaw Ghetto Rebellion, which was also a doomed effort, that there's no way that the Jews hiding in the Warsaw Ghetto would be able to fight off the bulk of the Nazi army. But nevertheless, they made a very heroic attempt of it and sent a signal to the rest of the world. It's a very comparable kind of comparison in terms of the size of forces. So the war lasted for about 3 years. We have coinage that survives that says, Bar Kokhba, Jerusalem, year 1, Bar Kokhba, Jerusalem, year 2, and a third that may be read year 3, and then the coinage disappears. So we're thinking that the war lasted approximately 3 years. At least Jerusalem was held for approximately 3 years, but ultimately it could not be sustained. The last stand was in Beitar, which has become a symbol for Jews throughout the centuries. Beitar was one of the last holdouts of the Bar Kokhba's rebels, and he had a very enthusiastic level of support from the local population. The Talmud says, did we lose this image? We'll come back. Okay. The Talmud says that in Beitar, there were 300 school children who, if they heard the Romans were approaching, would take their styluses, their pens, and they would run out of school to poke the Romans' eyes out. Just as an illustration, the Talmud was trying to say just how deep the support was for the Bar Kokhba revolution in this town, which is, by the way, is located in a place called, I forgot it, Karal Itil, I think I'll have to look it up. I'll make a little thing on the internet. These are, by the way, some of the ruins of Beitar in modern Israel. The Romans, however, besieged the city of Beitar, and they simply weeded out the Jews. They made sure to seal off any tunnels that may have been dug under the fortifications, and they did not engage the forces for a long time, and they basically starved them until they were forced to try and make a brace for it and to open up the siege, at which point the Romans, who had, of course, been well fed throughout the months and even years of the siege, they simply massacred the fighters of Beitar. The Talmudic descriptions of the carnage are, incredibly hyperbolic. Like, for example, they said that the Romans rode with their horses into blood up to their necks. So it's hard to imagine what that would be like. They said that the fields around Beitar were fertilized with Jewish blood for 3 years afterwards. All kinds of these extensive stories trying to describe how horrible the suffering was. Beitar eventually fell. One of the ironies of Jewish history, on the 9th of Av, which is kind of like the day in which so many tragedies have happened to the Jews, the destruction of the temples, actually the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto, the expulsion from Spain. It happens to be like a uniquely bad day for Jews. It's kind of in a sort of like national Jewish bad luck day. It's a really bad time for Jews, but I shouldn't joke about it. And Beitar fell on that day. The Romans, in an act of cruelty, would not allow other Jews to come and to retrieve the bodies, and they insisted on just leaving them there to rot in the August sun without burial. This lasted for approximately a week until finally the Romans, deciding that the revolution really was at an end, they finally allowed the Jews to come and collect the bodies of the dead and to bring them to burial. At which point the rabbis instituted a blessing in the liturgy, which is read always to remember the Bar Kokhba rebellion and the subsequent burial of the martyrs at Beitar. The blessing reads as follows. Blessed are you, Hashem, our God, King of the universe, the Almighty, our Father, our King, our Sovereign, our Creator, our Redeemer, our Maker, our Holy One of Jacob, our Shepherd, the Shepherd of Israel, the King who is good and who does good for all. For every single day he did good, he does good, and he will do good to us. He was bountiful with us, he is bountiful. He was bountiful with us, he is bountiful with us, and he will forever be bountiful with us, with grace and with kindness and with mercy, with relief, salvation, success, blessing, help, consolation, sustenance, support, mercy, life, peace, and all good, and of all good things may he never deprive us. Anyone recognize where that comes from? If I read the Hebrew, you probably get it right away. Exactly. It's the fourth blessing in benching, the one that ends Ali Chasreinu. So the grace after meals is specifically, this one paragraph was instituted by the rabbis in memory of the massacre at Beitar and the ultimate burial of the bodies. We actually have a lot of passages like that in the liturgy where the liturgy will not specifically refer to a historical event, but it's supposed to evoke the kind of feelings that the authors wanted. Another example, for example, would be the Al Harachamim prayer that we read on Shabbat, which is in memory of the massacres of 1096 in the Rhineland. Maybe we'll talk about it later. Rabbi Akiva lived through all of this, but 24,000 of his students famously did not. So there's a lot of discussion among historians. You know, as I'm sure you're familiar with the legend that 24,000 of Akiva's students died over one summer. And as a result, we have the period known as Sphira. Well, we call it Sphira because it coincides with a part of counting the Omer, with the Shirata Omer, the counting of the Omer, which is basically usually, it's between Passover and the holiday of Shavuot, and in that time there's roughly a month of semi-mourning. And the mourning includes, no haircuts, no listening to music, things like that, no buying new clothes, and it's supposed to be in memory of Rabbi Akiva's 24,000 students who died during that time. Now, the tradition does not state that they died in the Bar Kokhba rebellion, but given Akiva's support of Bar Kokhba, it stands to reason that his students would also support them. And the timing in the summer is exactly right. Some historians have opined that those 24,000 students died in battle with the Romans and not from a plague. The term plague that Talmud uses is kind of like a euphemism for the Romans. They actually may have died in combat, but that remains speculative. What is not speculative, however, is how the Romans dealt with the last elements of Bar Kokhba's orders, including Rabbi Akiva, at which point we have what's known as the Hadrianic persecutions. Hadrian came back with a vengeance and specifically ordered 10 great rabbis killed in an extremely public and demonstrative fashion. The most infamous of those deaths, of course, was reserved for Rabbi Akiva, whose flesh was raked from his body with iron combs. Chutzpis, the translator, whose head was removed from his body and dragged about the streets of Jerusalem by a pig. There are all these examples which we read actually in the liturgy. In Kela Ezra, we read this on the holiday of Yom Kippur. We go through the story of the so-called Asara Haruve Malchut, the 10 martyrs of the state, which were, those martyrs lost their lives in the immediate aftermath of the failed Bar Kokhba revolution. So we see that these events have directly affected the liturgical life of the Jew, even to the present day. Now, the last element that I find really fascinating about the whole Bar Kokhba story is one of the discoveries of the caches of materials left behind by the rebels. It's in this thing called the Cave of Letters, which is an extremely inaccessible spot near the Dead Sea, even less accessible than Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. It's in a cliff face where you have to walk across these extremely dangerous little narrow paths with a 600-foot drop 6 inches away, and then you have to make this this climb on a 50-foot ladder, which of course was not present back then. They used rope ladders and things like that to get to this cave with two entrances and a massive network of tunnels that housed entire families. The kind of materials that were found in these caves indicate that women and children lived with the rebels. I mean, you had entire families and who knows how many, maybe a few hundred people living in these caves for years. They had stocked up on water, which could only be got from about 10 miles away. There's no water otherwise. And they had evidence of ritual implements, and they had all, a full religious life going on inside these caves as they're hiding from the Romans. What I found absolutely amazing, and I had not heard about this before, was buried in the entrance to that cave of letters was a small packet. This is it here, discovered in 1960 by the Israeli archaeological team led by General Yadin, which contained the personal correspondence of a woman named Babata. And in this personal correspondence, we have all kinds of her letters describing a custody battle she had over one of her sons, her marriage contract, legal affairs that she was involved in. Absolutely fascinating materials. These are documents that were extremely important to her, so she buried them before she was ultimately killed, we presume, by the Romans, and they were found. So 2,000 years later. So the change of topic for next week is I'd like to find out everything we can about this woman, Babata, and try to understand what we can learn from this about the life of women in 2nd century Israel. But let me get back to Bar Kokhba and to bring it to a conclusion. Bar Kokhba's legacy is profound and confused in some ways. Profound in that this was the last major military attempt by the Jews to regain their land in ancient times, and it would be a long 1,800 years before they would ever dream of doing this again in a real fashion. It was a heroic rebellion, it was a successful rebellion, and it ended, however, badly in a very bloody massacre at Beitar, all of which we remember very profoundly in our liturgical tradition in particular. Perhaps the saddest element for the Jews, however, was the dashing of the messianic hope that Bar Kokhba represented. But at any rate, I thank you very much for your attention and your endurance. Next week we'll talk about Babata, and I hope you have a great night. Well, you made it all the way to the end of the video, so I hope that means that you really enjoyed it, or else you fell asleep in the terminal. But I just wanted to say thank you very much for watching. And, I'd like to develop more of a relationship with my viewers. And so please feel free to, click the like button or to leave a little comment at the bottom. I'll try to respond as much as possible. And if this video was useful to you, then please pass it on to someone else who might also find it so useful. Okay. Thank you very much, and have a great All right, tonight's topic is a little bit of a stretch for me. When I was putting together the series for this term, I tried very hard to include as many women as possible. And this is a difficult challenge for the ancient period. Once you've talked about Bruria, once you've talked about Rachel, the wife of Akiva, you run out of well-known named women very fast, simply because their voices are largely not recorded in our sources. But it's getting harder and harder as we go through, I think this is our 6th semester of giving lectures, to find women that we can speak about in a meaningful manner. But obviously you're talking about an important, huge element of Jewish civilization, of human civilization. I think it would be completely irresponsible to go straight through this period without looking specifically at women's lives and women's realities. So I'll do the best I can with Salome. The second problem I had, though, is that when I really did some more research on who was Salome, I'm not sure it's really the appropriate topic for a shul lecture. It's actually quite a salacious topic, as I've told some of you before the class began. I'll do my best to try and steer myself away from the shoals of titillating references in the context of this talk. So let's try and understand exactly who was Salome, or why are we talking about her. So first of all, she was a Jewish woman, but otherwise her connections to Jewish history are rather tenuous. She did not, contribute to Jewish intellectual history like Bruria did. She wasn't a Jewish leader like some of the queens were. She actually has a really tiny bit part in Jewish history, and in fact, we have no reference to her in any traditional Jewish sources other than Josephus, who is a little bit problematic for reasons that I'll discuss shortly. Nevertheless, there are some really good reasons to talk about her. One is the fact that she was the granddaughter of King Herod gives us an opportunity to speak about Herod's rule, at least briefly, and I would like to definitely dedicate a lecture to Herod in general in another context. And perhaps more significantly for our purposes is not so much who Salome was, but how she has been understood and how she has been manipulated throughout the centuries in a way that casts an unfortunate light on the appreciation of Jews in the broader society. Specifically, we're going to look at a medieval Christian exegesis of the story of Salome and try to understand how she and her figure and how she was understood had an impact on the way in which Jews were perceived in the broader society as a whole. So that's why I think we can justify the discussion of Salome in this series of Jewish biographies. And without further ado, let's go straight to the material. So who is this woman, Salome? Basically, I'm going to give you the actual narrative of her life based on the Gospels, the one episode that we have from the ancient world. But she has been tremendously popularized in medieval and in modern Christian and secular art. Most specifically, an opera by Richard Strauss made her quite famous in the 19th century, and a play version by Oscar Wilde, which we'll see in just a second. She represents so many things to those who appreciated her story throughout the last 2,000 years, but as I mentioned, not all of them are complementary when it comes to Jews. Let me show you just a little bit of an interesting clip. This is from a 1923 art film, arguably one of the first art films ever, that portrays Salome, the main scene of Salome's life. Here on the left is her drunken father, Herod II. Herod had about 9 wives and about 16 children, many of whom he named Herod, so it's very confusing trying to keep track of how many Herods we're talking about. This is Herod, his son, and he's at a drunken party with his friends, and he convinces his stepdaughter, Salome, to dance before the assembled guests. She dances this famous dance. This is Anna Nezamova, I think her name was, a famous dancer from the 1920s who performs this dance of the 7 veils, which arouses Herod II, that is Herod's son, not King Herod, to such a degree that he promises her half the kingdom for any request that she makes. So we'll have to talk about that request. Now, perhaps the most famous version of Salome that we have today is the version authored by the great writer Oscar Wilde, shown in the little inset here in the photograph. The edition that's published has the phenomenal artwork of Aubrey Beardsley as well. You can see the famous peacock dress here in the background. Wilde took the story of Salome, which I have not told you in full yet, and he used it as a metaphor for forbidden love, which of course was very relevant to his own life as a homosexual at the turn of the 20th century. The metaphor of forbidden love was extremely relevant to him. It was illegal for him to perform this play, in England, so he wrote it in French and then translated his own work back into English, which apparently, according to some loophole in the law, he was allowed to do, and it was performed in English in his own translation from his French original, and it made quite a sensation. But as we shall discuss a little further on in tonight's lecture, it was an example of using the Salome story for his own personal agenda, specifically related to forbidden love, but nevertheless it made a huge impact on the literary scene of the day. So what is the narrative? I'm going to read to you a short sort of a paraphrase of the account that we have in the Gospels, which comes from William Chester Jordan, who is a professor at Princeton, who's written a fantastic article on the way that Salome has been portrayed in the Middle Ages. So once again, our sources for Salome's life are principally two. We have the Gospels, that is the Christian Bible. There are two specific versions of the story, one which probably borrows from the other. And then we have another reference in Josephus. Josephus is the major Jewish historian of the first century. You will recall perhaps from our lectures last year that he was a Jewish general. He defected to the Roman side, and then he wrote an incredibly detailed account of the first Roman-Jewish war in the 8th century, the 8th decade of the first century, and then was very well read, and Romans read it. He received great accolades, and then he went on to write a massive 20-odd volume Jewish Antiquities, which is basically the history of Jews of all time. And these were documents that were produced for a Roman imperial audience, so they're not necessarily the most authoritative versions of Jewish history that we would like to perhaps read, but nevertheless, he has a version of the Salome story there. She is named in that story. She's not named in the Gospel, so there's no reason to suspect that this event did not actually happen. So here's the version that Dr. Jordan prepared for us based on the Gospels. Herod the Tetrarch refers to the three sons of Herod that ruled the principle of Judea in the first century. After he died, he divided up into three rulers. Tetra, meaning tetra is three, right? Right. What's four? Quattro. Thank you. And arch means like leader, archos, right? Democracy, right? Herod the Tetrarch ordered the arrest of John the Baptist and had him imprisoned in chains. John the Baptist, of course, a very important early Christian figure, and we're going to return to him as well. Herod's reason for doing so, for arresting John the Baptist, was the furious complaint of his wife, Herodias, right, also named after Herod, and he'd like to name a lot of his kids after himself, at John's public condemnation of their marriage, right? So Herod's wife, Herodias, was angry with John the Baptist, so Herod had him imprisoned. Why was Herodias angry with John the Baptist? Herodias was the former wife of Philip, Herod's brother, whom she had left to marry the Tetrarch Herod. So in other words, she was married to one son of Herod. She left him and married the other son of Herod, which was forbidden under Jewish law. By the way, all these people are Jewish. Okay, so we're talking about Jewish kings, corrupt, obviously. Herod himself, as we'll talk about, was actually from an Idumean family, which was Edomites, but that's already 4 generations ago. So these are they're like the rich and famous among the Jews, and they have the sort of pick and place that we can imagine. Anyway, so right, Herodias, the wife, had married Philip, the son of Herod. She left him and married Herod, the son of Herod. And John the Baptist, Jewish guy, criticized her for marrying her brother's brother during his lifetime, which is forbidden in Jewish law. John railed against Herod, saying, "It is against the law for you to marry your brother's wife." Sounds like a good rabbi would say this. At first, Herod wanted to kill John, but he hesitated because of John's popularity and the widespread belief that the Baptist was a prophet, right? Which is, this is, of course, a Christian document that we're reading now. The popularity of John is alluded to here. Later, Herod came to hold John in awe. He did not understand all the Baptist's prophetic utterances, but he enjoyed listening to him and came to regard him as a good and upright man. Indeed, he protected him, letting him live despite his wife's loathing and her continued desire to have him killed. An opportunity arose for her to fulfill her desire at Herod's birthday banquet, which his courtiers, military commanders, and various elite male members of society attended, right? So let's get the scene right. The husband, Herod, he has imprisoned John the Baptist at his wife's insistence. The wife is upset because John the Baptist is casting asparagus at their wedding. No, casting aspersions, right, at their marriage. I shouldn't say things like that. I'll edit it out, right, Mr. Rodriguez? Right. Because he's giving her a hassle about their wedding. So John the Baptist is sitting in prison, and Herodias gets an idea. Aha, how about this? My husband Herod is going to have a massive drunken birthday party. It's going to be all men there. I happen to have, says Herodias, a beautiful young daughter from my first marriage to Herod's brother. So this would be Herod's niece and stepdaughter. She says, Herodias' daughter by her former husband danced before the assembled company, and so delighted Herod that he swore to give her anything she wanted, even half his realm. Right? So she essentially prostituted her daughter before Herod to convince him to give up anything he wanted, because she knew her husband and that he would like make some kind of sweeping statement in front of all his friends, and then it would be very difficult for him to retract. After talking to her mother, the girl asked for John the Baptist's head on a dish. And so this was all planned, and once she had achieved this, secured this promise from her father, she went back, or her stepfather, she went to her mother, and mother said, great, you have to ask him for the head of John the Baptist on a platter. Herod's distress was palpable. Turn the page right now, I want to find out what happened. But he did not wish to lose face before his powerful guests, and he ordered a bodyguard to behead John. After carrying out his task, the guard returned to the banquet with the head on a dish and gave it to the girl, who then gave it to her mother. When John's disciples heard the news, they claimed his body and buried it. So the theme of this young, beautiful girl, sexually alluring, possibly very innocent, possibly so young she's a virgin herself, dealing with the disembodied head of John the Baptist, was so grotesque it fascinated medieval artists, and we have literally hundreds of examples of this depiction of the young, beautiful girl and the decapitated John the Baptist. Here's one from Titian from the 16th century, and here you can see a piece of monumental architecture. Lots of these, sometimes with spooky backgrounds. You can see the artists are just loving this whole contrast between the beautiful youth and the decapitated John the Baptist. We could do this all day. There are tons of these examples. It seems they're having a huge field day with what's going on. Here is an early 20th century example from one of these staging the plays. Now, this is basically all we know from the ancient sources, from Josephus and from the Gospels. There is an apocryphal text that may also be ancient in origin, which describes Salome's death, which perhaps I might as well mention at this point. Apparently, she went on to marry, and she had several children, and then in the year 39, which would mean that she's probably in her 40s by this time, because she was traveling to Gaul, would be, let's say, France, and she, and again, this is not in the original text, this is something added much later, and we don't know how truthful it is, but she was walking on a pond, she fell into the water, and as she was falling into the water, her head hit the edge of the ice, and she was decapitated in a poetic and ironic manner, and her mother retrieved the body, the head as well. I could not find that the artists don't seem especially interested in that theme, but that's how she met her gory end, as the apocryphal text has it. Now to take it a step further, to go back to Oscar Wilde, for example, the bit that Wilde adds, that's not in the story at all, but obviously had a very powerful impact. He also adds a sexual attraction between Salome and John the Baptist, and that she's confused and she wants him, but she can't have him, and so then she gives into her her mother's wishes, and she has him decapitated. And there's a very powerful scene at the end where she says, I could not kiss your lips in life, so now I kiss thee in death. Very powerful. You connect it back to Wilde's personal history. It makes a lot more sense, and so on. So it's a fascinating story that gripped the imagination of much of the medieval Christian exegetes and even the modern mind. And in fact, there are versions of the Salome story in song and in writing. If you happen to look at the Wikipedia article, they list about 30 versions of Salome in modern culture in the 20th and 21st century. So it's definitely an enduring kind of myth, if you will, that takes us to the next question, which is really, why are we talking about this in a Jewish history class, right? She's Jewish, but where's the Jewish part to this? Okay. So, first of all, let's go back in time a little bit to understand her background, and Herod in particular. This is a Roman rendition of Herod, may actually be somewhat accurate. I will show you the best rendition we have, a period rendition of Salome a little later. And he's an extremely complex character that deserves an entire lecture easily. He was a client king of the Romans, which meant that when the Romans came into the Middle East, particularly in the first century before the Common Era, they dealt with the remnants of the Hashmonaim, who had already been falling into a certain amount of internal corruption and palace intrigue that led to their internal weakness and eventual demise. And the Romans were able to take over this very fractured nation without too much difficulty. Herod had gone to Rome and had petitioned successfully to become their client king in Israel. Remind you once again, we're talking now about Salome's grandfather. So now we're in the first century before the Common Era. This term client king is interesting. The Roman strategy of managing all these disparate populations was known as divide et impera, which we have in English, the common phrase, divide and rule. And the way they did it was they would take certain elements of society, usually the aristocracy, and actually give them a lot of privileges, give them citizenship, remove from them tax burdens and all kinds of things, and by co-opting key elements in the given societies that they controlled, they were able to essentially manage all these hugely different cultures and political systems with relatively little effort on their part. From time to time, they would have to use force of arms and they have to demonstrate their military might, but really their genius as a civilization was in governance through co-opting the elites of all these societies. So Herod was one of those co-opted elites. The Sadducees in charge of the temple ritual, we talked about them in the previous class, were also one of these co-opted elites. And he came into Israel and he ruled with a maniacal intensity and a ferocious degree of personal viciousness. He was married to a woman named Doris at the time that he received the kingship. When he got back to Israel, he felt that she was not really befitting his role as a leader of a country, as a client king. So he sent her away, married another woman named Mariamne. Actually, according to the Talmud, he later killed her as well. According to the Talmud, he actually preserved her body in honey. He kept her around, and the purpose of the honey was to keep her body supple. For you just have to use your imagination. It's the worst possible thing you can think of. Herod was definitely not going to make it on, the Jewish President of the Year award. That's a stupid thing to say. I'll probably edit that part out too, right? Okay, but some terrible things about Herod. Now, at the same time, that we have this terrible, crazy king who's murdering his relatives left and right, and doing all kinds of awful things. We also have him as the renovator of the temple. In fact, all the pictures of the temple that we associate with holiness and things like that, the western wall, he built the Temple Mount, again, on earlier foundations, Hashmonaic stones, and also on the stones in the Reign of Solomon.